Hey guys, SimCoder here, and today we are going to continue on our TikTok clone series, and we are going to implement a following system. So we are going to, by the end of this video, be able to follow other users, which our goal for doing this is to actually be able to emulate the chatting system of TikTok. So on TikTok, for you to be able to talk to other people via the chat, you have to be following them and they have to be following you. So we are going to implement this following system to be able to implement that specific feature. We are also going to adjust the feed system so that the height of the videos does match the entire height of the available screen for the feed. This has changed because, well, right now we have two feed systems. Basically, we have one inside of the profile and one for our own feed. So we have to calculate the height depending on the bottom tab navigator height, and that's another thing that we'll be doing today. So it is going to be a packed video, and well, I hope you enjoy it. If you are enjoying this series thus far, then please don't forget to leave a like down below and a subscribe, as it helps me to grow this channel and to be able to provide these videos more and more. So yeah, let's do it. Okay, so let's get started. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to actually fix the height of the feed, of the items within the feed, better yet. So first of all, we have to figure out what the problem is and to understand what the problem is. So in the main feed, if I scroll down, you'll see that there's a bit of a give in the last video. And this is because the height is not correct yet. So you are able to view a bit of the post made up top, and that's something that we have to fix, unfortunately. Within the profile, the problem doubles down because we get this terrible bar at the bottom. So as you can see, the heights are not adjusted for our app, so we have to figure out a way to fix it. For this, we are going to go into Source, Screens, Feed, and enter it. In here, we are going to figure out a way of calculating the height of the item that we render depending on the height of the bottom nav bar. So for this, I'm actually going to comment this post item just to make sure it is easier to view, as our videos are all the same. And by commenting it out, I'm going to come in here and calculate the color, the background color of the post depending on the index. So I'm going to do background color equals to, if the mod of the index divided by 2 is 0, then I'm going to make sure the background color is red. If not, I'm going to make it blue, just to make it stand out a bit. Then I'm going to apply this background color in here, save it, and as you can see, the colors change, and we are able to view the problem even better right now. So as you can see, I'm in the last post, even though I'm still able to view a bit of the red from the post above. So let's learn how to fix this. For this, we are going to first come in here and do const feed item height will be equal to something, which will be the height of the screen minus the height of the bottom bar. And in order to get the height of the bottom bar, we are going to create a custom hook for this specifically, because we also have to take into account the feed that we get when we enter the profile. In here, we don't have the bottom navigation bar, and because of that, the calculation is a bit different. So for now, let's just give it the base case, which is the feed item height will be equal to the dimensions of the window, the height parameter of the dimensions of the window. So let's apply it in here. And when we do, we still get the same problem because that's what we were passing before. So let's learn how we can actually get a custom hook which will determine the height of the feed item, taking into account the bottom navigation bar. So for this, I'm going to go into hooks and I'm going to create a new one. This one will be called use material nav bar height.js. And this solution, just to keep everything pretty straightforward, I didn't come up with this myself, even though it isn't that hard to do. I found it on GitHub, and I'm going to link it down below so that you can actually view the full thread of people asking how to actually do this. So I'm going to call it use material navbar height equals to nothing at this moment, and then open up an arrow function. And just to keep things clear, if you were to use not the material version of the bottom bar, but just the bottom bar navigation from React Navigation without it being material, you have two different packages for it. That one has a custom hook which will tell you the height of the bottom bar, which makes it a bit easier to calculate. With the material navbar, bottom navbar, it doesn't have a hook which tells you the current height of the bottom navbar. So I'm going to assume the bottom bar's height is always 54, as that's what is inside of the code. And I'm going to hard code it inside of this custom hook. So before that, we have to take one thing into account, which are the insets, the bottom insets of every device. So this device has this bottom navigation, the go back, the go home, and the go to the apps that you have opened. However, if you go into an iPhone, for example, or most devices have it right now, where you are able to, with swipe actions, replace this bottom bar right here, then you'll get some insets. In the bottom part of the screen. The inset just means that there's an area of the screen which is completely unusable. Most of the times it appears as a line in here, a gray line, where you can actually execute the gestures in order to go home, to go back, to go to the app drawer, whatever. So when you have that enabled, this area of the screen is completely unusable. And so you have to take that into account in order to make this calculation. So in here, it will be const bottom equals to use save area insets. And this will give us the height in pixels that we have to discount or disregard when that part is enabled with gestures. So it is really important to do this. So if I come in here and I simply console log this bottom, and before that, we actually have to call this hook, obviously. And for that, what we are going to do is to, in this height, simply discount the use material navbar height. And there's an error with the import. Let me go above. Okay, hooks, go back, hooks, and there we go. Okay, and because we are using an arrow function, we have to do it in the following way. So export default at the bottom, and in here we are going to simply do const use material navbar height. And there you go, now it is working. So now, if you come in here, you'll see that the bottom is 0. However, if I had an emulator with the gestures enabled, then this bottom would be different from 0. Okay, so now what we are going to do is, instead of returning simply 0, we are going to do return bottom plus 54. And as you can see, this is still not correct. So if I come in here and I subtract instead of adding, it will become better. However, if I continue to scroll, it is still wrong. So how can you fix this? Well, it is still wrong because of the top bar in here, the top status bar, better yet. So if I add insets of top, this will give us the height at the top that we are not meant to use. So if I come in here and I console log this, let's scroll above, let's save it again just so that we can refresh it. We see that top is 49 dot something. So if I come in here and do minus top and save it, it is incorrect, and this is because instead of subtracting the 54, we have to add it. And why is that? Well, if you remember correctly, the feed item height is calculated getting the window height and subtracting the material navbar height. So in here we are calculating bottom, which are the insets in the bottom, plus 54, which is the height of the bottom navbar, minus the top, which will just let us give us some leeway in order to make sure we don't use any height that we are not meant to use, and this way it will start to look a bit better. So in here I'm just going to add a math.floor, just because it is a decimal number, and so we want to remove that little bit up top, and that would appear if we continue to scroll, because it will continue to add that little piece of decimal, and eventually it will grow to something bigger. So by flooring it, it will look a ton better. Okay, so now that we have this, we are able to go into the profile, enter it, and you'll see that there is this bar at the bottom. So how can we fix it? Well, the issue in here is that we have one height for the feed and one height for the profile feed. So in here we have to pass the variable profile. Profile is a boolean which lets us know if we are in the profile or not, and this is what we are going to use in order to figure it out. And in here we are going to say without bottom tabs. This is going to be the name of the variable, just make it a bit more comprehensible. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm actually going to move this to the front of it so that it is easier to read. And I'm going to say without bottom tabs, question mark, and make a ternary operation in here. If without, then simply add 0, because, well, there are no bottom tabs. If without bottom tabs is set to false, then add it and make sure that the height of the bottom bars is accounted for. So when we save this, it is still not correct, and it is still not correct because in here I forgot to add the parentheses. So let's add them, and there we go. Now it is working, and now it looks actually good. So in order to view our work, let's come in here and remove this comment, and so that we can actually render the item. Let's do it. Okay, looks good. Looks good. There are no edges sticking out. Awesome. And if you go into the profile, it also looks good. So there you go. Now this part is done. Okay, so now that this is done, we are able to move on to the following system. So let's jump into the interesting part of the lesson. Let's go into the profile, and in here we are going to jump into the header, because this is where this top part of the header is rendered. So this is where we are going to work on. Okay, the first thing that we have to figure out is that we have to only show the edit profile to if we are viewing our own profile. So in here I'm going to do firebase.auth.currentUser.uid equals to user.uid. We get this user in the parameters of this function. Then we are going to simply render out the button that we already had. So I'm going to grab this, move it in here, save that, and if not, then it's simply return null, just for the time being. We also have to import Firebase, so import Firebase from Firebase. There we go. So if we go into our profile, nothing changes. However, if we go into the first post, this post was created by another user, then nothing appears. Now we have to figure out what to render when the current user doesn't match the user.uid bar yet. So for this, I'm going to come in here and create a function called render follow button. This render follow button will be equal to, an empty set of parameters, and we are going to open up an arrow function. In here, we are going to set for the time being a variable called following, or better yet, is following. Later on, we'll mess with the database actions, but for now, I just want to render something on the screen. So we are going to say if is following, because remember we have two sets of buttons, one button for when we are actually following the user and another button for when we are not following the user. So if we are following, then we are going to do something. If we are not following the current user that we are viewing, then we are going to show a follow button. So for this, I'm going to grab the button that we already have for the edit profile, and I'm going to change it a bit. So let's save it, and in here, instead of edit profile, it will be follow. So for now, let's just render this and see what appears. Let's come in here and do render follow button. And there's an error in here because we are not returning anything at the time. So we have to return this touchable opacity. And when we do, follow appears. Great. However, it doesn't look all that much with the button from TikTok. So let's actually improve it. So let's come in here and do fields button. This field button won't have a border. It will have a border radius, but it will be slightly different because the background color won't be just simply white. It will be the color that we have used before, which is FF4040. This is the color of TikTok, that salmon color that they use. I'm going to replace the button styles of this button with field button, save it, and there we go, it appears. One thing that I'm going to do is to enlarge the padding horizontal, just make it a bit bigger, and I'm going to add another style, which will be field button text. This field button text is going to be the styles of the text that appears inside the button. So let's do color, which will be white. And we can even add font weight of like 700 or something like that. Let's try it. And this has to be a string. So let's do it like so. Save it. Let's grab that style, come in here and do style equal to button styles dot field button text. And there you go. Now it looks a ton better. The next thing that we have to do is to add the buttons for when we are actually already following the user. So I'm going to set this variable to false. These will disappear in a second, or better yet, to true. These will disappear, and now we are able to work on it. I'm going to copy this button because it will be pretty much the same. I'm going to add a view and dump the button in there. We are going to have two buttons because, well, TikTok has, when you follow a user, TikTok has a button in order to message that user and another button to unfollow the user. So I'm going to grab this and save it. And yeah, again, I forgot to return it. So let's do it. View, and move everything into the return. There you go. Now, one thing that we have to do is make sure this style will have a flex direction of row. Okay, and now we are going to, well, first of all, return the first button to the grayed out outline button, like so, and we are going to remove this style from there. So styles, and we are going to remove it. Instead of follow, it will be message. So instead of having this field button text, we are going to have a grayed out field button text, better yet, grayed outline button text. So let's come in here, do this, and in here, instead of white, it will be simply black. Let's grab it, come in here, and simply replace it. Okay, there we go. Now, instead of follow, it will be message, and there you go. Now it is done. I'm going to remove these on press for the time being, as they are not useful at the moment. Okay, so now let's handle the icon that appears on the side of the button. So I'm going to use this gray outline button in here just to have some placeholders for this. And I'm going to remove this text because we are going to use a feather icon. And the feather icon usually doesn't auto import. So I'm going to go up top and do import feather from Expo vector icons. And when we do this, nothing will appear because we have to set a name. So the name in this case will be user check. Let's save it and close the tag. It appears awesome. However, it is really small. So let's enlarge it a bit. Let's set it to 20. Okay, it looks better. However, this button doesn't look right. It has to have a margin to the left, and the padding, horizontal padding, has to be a bit smaller. So I'm going to change this gray outline button for gray outline icon button. Let's grab it, go into the file, and do gray outline button. Will be equal to pretty much the same thing as the gray outline button, or better yet, gray outline icon button will be pretty much the same thing as the gray outline button. However, the width, or better yet, the padding of the button will be slightly less. Let's try with 10. And I forgot to save the original file. There you go. Now it looks better. And I'm going to add a margin horizontal of 10 as well. And there you go. Now it looks better. I'm going to actually increment just a bit the padding horizontal. And yeah, that to me seems right. Okay, so now that we have this and we have our UI working, we are able to come in here and change this Boolean value in order to match what we are actually displaying. So true, false, true, and it will change. Sometimes when we save it, it doesn't trigger a render for some reason, but yeah, it is working. Okay, so now we have to figure out a way of actually managing this. So we want to click on this button and the user to be unfollowed. And if we click on the follow button, we want to actually follow the user. And right now it is still going to this edit profile. So like so. Okay, so let's figure out first how the database is structured. Okay, so here we are in the Firestore database, and if I go into this user, I've created a collection to emulate the actions, the following actions. So if you go into following, you'll see that this ID appears. This ID matches the ID of this user. So if this happens, it means that the user that starts with an IO, U, and G is following the user that starts with a G, I, G, M. So this user right here. And so when we follow this user, this ID is added into this collection. When we unfollow a user, this ID is simply removed from this collection. So let's learn how we can actually do that. But before that, we have to figure out a way of getting that data on our side. And we are going to use React Query for this. And the reason is really, really simple. We don't want to be always making requests to the database in order to get the current state of the user that we are viewing. So anytime we enter this user's profile, we don't want to make a request to see the current following state of that user. So we are going to do one thing that's called optimistic writes, which it basically means that we make a request to the database, we write to the database. In this case, we either write or delete, depending on if it is a follow or unfollow action. And we are going to automatically assume that the write or delete was successful and update the UI accordingly. And we are going to manage the state on our side so that we make the first request to get the following state, and then we never have to do it again while the app lives, because we have that information within our cache. And for that, well, we are going to use React Query because it is pretty much easy to do and it is the most straightforward way of doing this. Okay, so enough with the words, let's actually get on with it. The first thing that we'll have to do is to create another hook called useFollowing. So I'm going to come in here and duplicate the user and rename it so that it is useFollowing. Save that. And in here it isn't user, it is useFollowing. Save that. And I'm going to change somewhat how this is structured, the query keys mainly, because I want to have a file which will contain all of the types of query keys that we possibly have. So let's handle that right now. So in the query keys, instead of just exporting this value, I'm going to export a constant called keys. The keys will have an object which, well, for the user, because it is the only key that we are using right now, it is going to receive a user. And with an arrow function, we are going to simply return user, an array with user and user, the second user being the variable that we pass along. So why are we doing this? And let's go into the user for a second. It is just to keep things a bit more organized so that we have our keys all in the same place. Remember, the keys are what associates the cache, if you want to think of it like that, to the request that we make. So in this case, let's simply do keys.user and pass along user ID. So in this case, anytime we make a request with user, or anytime we call user with the user ID, let's imagine user ID 1, then it will go to the keys, inject user ID 1 into this variable, and we'll be able to figure out where in the cache that user is. Or better yet, React Query does that for us, so we don't even have to think about it. Okay, so now that the user is done, we are able to close it. Let's go into the useFollowing. And again, instead of this user key and user ID, we are going to do keys dot user following. Okay, right now it doesn't contain anything, but we know beforehand that it will receive a user ID and other user ID. So other user ID will be the one that we want to see if the current user is following, and the user ID will be the current user. So in here, let's pass the other user ID, and let's go into the keys in order to actually create this key. So user following, 2 points, user ID and other user ID. So how are we going to structure this? Well, it is going to be pretty much similar to what we did in here. However, it will be, instead of user, it will be following. And then the second parameter will be a combination of both the user and the user ID. And why are we doing it? For now, we are just viewing what users the current user is following. However, when we get to the chat system, we also have to figure out what the other user is following. So because in order to chat with one another, both of them have to be following each other. So we have to keep in cache both if the current user is following the other user and if the other user is following the current user. And this is a cool way of doing this because for when we get the other user following state of us, then we can simply replace this and this be the user ID. This will be done with code, obviously, so the user ID will be the other user ID and the other user ID will be the user ID. If we imagine that the user ID, this one, is the current logged in user ID. This is why we are doing this. Okay, so let's save it. And now what we have to do is to write a function which will get the follow state of the follows that we want to get. So this is pretty simple, and let's go into the user.js file, and I'm going to double up on this function. So let's come in here and do get is following. It will receive the user ID and the other user ID, and right now it will be collection user.doc user ID.collection following .doc other user ID .get. Then we are going to resolve if this document exists. It isn't a snapshot, it is more of a doc, so let's simply do it like so. So if the doc exists, it means that the user is following the other user. So if this exists, it means that this user is following this user. If it doesn't exist, it means that it isn't following the other user. So that's how we are going to handle this. Let's save it and let's get this function and inject it in here. Get is following, like so. And now we are basically done. What we have to do next is come in here and actually call up this custom hook and call it is following equals to use following, and it will probably be wrong. Yeah, so let's do go back, hooks, use following, like so. Okay, so if you can remember, this one will receive 2 parameters. So the first one will be firebase.auth.current-user.uid, and the other parameter will be the user that we want to see if the current user is following. So it will be user.uid. Save that. And I'm going to remove this function, this value in here. So I'm going to quickly reload the app just so that we can get it cleanly. Okay, and I'm going to come in here and console log is following. Save that. And when we do, we obviously get this massive object. So I'm going to go in here and do .data, save it. And for the first user, we get that is following is equal to false. So we are able to follow the user. And for the second user, well, it is myself, so it doesn't render the buttons. However, it does need this styling in here, so I'm going to grab it. It is the gray outline button text. Let's come in here and dump it. There you go. Now it looks better. And it doesn't seem right because this user, I'm sure, exists within our collection. So the user that I'm viewing matches this one. So something is wrong. Let's go into the use following, and there we go. I forgot to add both users in the get is following. So when we save it, I'm going to quickly rerun the app just to see if this fixed it. Let's give it a second. And now it is fixed. So we are following this user and these buttons appear. So there you go. Now what we have to do is to actually handle the actions. So let's handle that next. So the first thing that we are going to do is to actually change the following states. So for this, we are going to come in here and do change follow state, and we are going to receive the user that we want to change the following state of and the current following state. Remember, this is going to be an optimistic implementation, so we have to always have the isFollowing value on our side, and this is going to be handled by React Query, and we will see how to do that in a second. So if isFollowing, then we are going to grab this call, but instead of doing get, we are going to simply delete. And I'm going to remove this, and I'm going to simply resolve because we don't need anything else. Let's do it like so, save it like that. Okay, but if the user isn't being followed by the current user, then we are going to, instead of delete, we are going to set. Set will add this to the database, to the collection, this document to the following collection, better yet. But instead of user ID, we are going to do firebase.auth.currentuser.uid. Because, well, we are only going to allow you to follow another user if you are following from within your account. So this makes sure no user is able to do some finicky stuff with our app. So I'm going to replace the user ID with other user ID, and that's it. We have our function. Now we have to learn how to use it and how to inject the data into our use query. This is really interesting because it basically allows us to do a lot more stuff than we were able to do before. React Query allows you to handle changes to the cache system whenever you want to. And these are called mutations. Mutations are basically associated with making a request to the database and changing the state of something that you want to do. So for example, in the following system, we are going to mutate the use following data in order to actually call this function, the change follow state, and to alter the current state that is inside React Query at the moment. React Query is much more powerful than that, and it allows you to have loading states built into your system without actually coding them, and a lot more other stuff that we want to do that we are not going to use currently. But it also allows you to do optimistic writes to the database and for you to not have to worry about any of the logic associated with that. So right now what we are going to do is come in here and double up on the use following, but we are going to call it use following mutation. Save that and add the name in here. Use following mutation, like so. So it is just going to receive options, and it is going to return a use mutation. So I'm going to come in here and simply comment these out for the time being. And I'm going to say use mutation. So when you use mutation, you have to first give it the function that will actually make the call to the database. So change follow state in this case. Then we are going to pass it an object which will have all of the options that we might want to pass it along. And we are going to pass some functions, or better yet, a function which will be a callback for various states of the request. So you have, for example, on success, which triggers whenever the right action, for example, actually succeeds. You have an on error for when it fails, well, when reject is called or when resolve is called. And then you have this on mutate. On mutate is called in the second that this mutation is called. So it doesn't wait for the request to be successful or not. It simply tells you that this mutation was called, so what do you want to do with it? Okay, so it will receive the variables being the variables with which you call the mutation, and let's create an arrow function. But before carrying on, let's actually create the mutation within our front end. So let's go into the index, so the profile header, and in here we are going to do const is following mutation equals to use following mutation. So this import is wrong, so it has to be 2 points, 2 points, 2 points. Save that, and I'm going to start the app again because it's clicked on me for some reason. And we are going to use this is following mutation inside of a non-press. So in the case of this follow, when you are not actually following the user that you are viewing, you are going to do on press, open arrow function, is following mutation dot mutate. And it is going to mutate, and we are going to pass some data to it. So we are going to pass the user ID that we want to actually follow. So user ID 2 points user dot UID, and we are going to pass along is following so that we get the current state of the follow between these two users. Okay, let's save it. And one other thing that we want to do is actually to do it here again inside of the other button. So not this one, but the one with the icon. And it will be pretty much the same thing because this is following is variable and the user ID is always the same. Okay, so now coming back in here, let's save this. And let's figure out first what happens when we call this function. So I'm going to come in here, and as I promised, when you click a button, this onMutate will trigger right away. So let's say mutation triggered, and let's create another console log with the variables that we get from it. So let's save it, let's open up the terminal, and let's click on this button. In here, we see that mutation triggered, and it triggered with the value is following set to true, and the user ID set to this. So it gets basically the data that we passed along in here, so these objects. And this way, we are able to manage the state of the cache system optimistically so that we don't have to make another query to get the current following state of this user. So in order to update the cache system, what we have to do is to first get the query client. Query client equals to use query client. Save that. And in here, we're going to do query client dot set queries data, or better yet, query data. For now, we just have to worry about this function. We don't have to worry about the set queries data. That will be for another day. So when we set the queries data, we'll basically pass it the keys that we want to actually change the data of. So keys dot user following, and this time it will be Firebase dot auth dot current user dot UID, and variables, because remember that user ID comes in this object, dot user ID. Don't forget to import Firebase. Like so. Let's simply disregard that for a second. And these keys, as you might remember, simply combines both the user ID and the other user ID into this array, so that we can associate it with a place within our cache system. Then the last parameter of this set query data is the updater. The updater is basically a function that returns something that will be the new value for this specific key. So because we just want to return a value and we don't have to do any complicated calculation, what we can do is simply pass the value directly. And what is the value? Well, because we get the current following state inside of our variables with the is following, we are able to simply negate it. So exclamation points variables dot is following, and this will update the value to wherever we need it to be. Okay, so now if you come in here and actually unfollow this user, it will automatically trigger the mutation and update the cache. And when that happens, this is following will trigger an update, and the is following variable will update, and this render follow button will change according to the current follow state. Then if we come in here and follow, it will do that all over again. And let's grab the database and it doesn't seem to be working. Let's figure out why. These console logs can be moved from here. This user ID, I want to change to other user ID, so I'm going to do some cleanup now because that's what makes more sense. Let's remove these spaces like so. Now, inside of our index, it is meant to be other user ID, so let's do it like so. And these values will be automatically passed along to the change follow state. So, and here is the main problem. In here, it has to be an object, so we deconstruct the object and we automatically get in here. So now let's try and see if that fixed our issue. Let's follow and nothing changes. Let's unfollow and it is removed. Let's follow it again and it is added. Let's unfollow and it is removed. So there you go, it is working. For this lesson, I'm not going to worry about the following counter just because, it is a lot of work for now and the lesson is getting kind of long, but the following system is working, so our main goal for this video is done. So thank you all so much for watching. We now have a following system implemented, so we are ready to start working on the chat system. So that will be done in the next video. So if you don't want to miss that video, then please make sure you are subscribed. And again, if you like this video, then please do leave it a like while you are down there. So yeah, I hope to see you again tomorrow. Ciao.